Millionaire's daughter had never spoken until he found the black nanny and his daughter singing. Asterisk asterisk, the cameras clicked like 100 tiny hammers striking glass. At the center of the press conference, Ethan Caldwell sat stiff in a charcoal suit, his jaw locked, eyes darting toward the floor. Beside him, Sophie stood on a small step stool so the microphones could reach her height. She was speaking, not whispering, not mumbling, but delivering flawless French to a crowd of reporters who leaned forward as if afraid to miss a single syllable. The child they had been told for years could barely form words now held an entire room silent. On the far end of the stage, Layla Carter adjusted the stack of thick folders in her arms, each one stamped with the seal of the Columbia University Children's Rights Center. Every document inside told a story Ethan had spent years keeping locked away. That a ripple of murmurs passed through the journalists. Words like neglect and misdiagnosis hissed under their breath. Ethan's hands tightened on the podium. Sophie didn't look at him. She was focused entirely on the audience, on the truth finally leaving her lips. But what had pushed this man to silence his own daughter? And how had the woman standing on the edge of the stage pulled the truth into the light? The Caldwell estate rested at the edge of Fairview Hills, a neighborhood where every lawn was perfectly trimmed and every driveway gleamed with imported cars. Behind its white columns and glass balcony, the place felt less like a home and more like a museum, silent, polished, and strangely cold. Ethan Caldwell had built his fortune in high-stakes mergers, the kind where a single phone call could shift millions. He thrived in negotiations, always winning, always calculating. That same precision, however, spilled into his parenting. He treated his daughter's life like a project to be managed rather than a soul to be nurtured. Sophie Caldwell entered the world quietly, her first cry barely a whisper. Doctors said she was healthy, but as months turned into years, she spoke rarely. By the time she was 4, the neighbors whispered that she might never find her voice. Ethan accepted that story too easily, as if it freed him from the messier work of connection. Layla Carter arrived at the Caldwell house on a spring morning, carrying nothing more than a worn leather satchel and a resume that could have opened doors in any elite school in the country. She held degrees in child psychology and language development, and she had worked with children who had faced far greater barriers than Sophie. Yet, Ethan introduced her to guests as the nanny. As though her expertise did not deserve a fuller title, it did not take long for Layla to notice the unspoken rules in the Caldwell household. Conversations were brief, almost transactional. Eye contact was rare. Sophie kept close to the walls, like someone who had learned to stay out of sight. Ethan, meanwhile, spoke of his daughter's condition as if it was an established fact, never a question to explore. The first hint of something deeper came on a rainy afternoon. Layla found Sophie sitting by the window, humming to herself. It was not random noise. The melody was precise, controlled. When Layla responded in French, Sophie turned her head sharply, eyes wide, and replied in perfect grammar. That was the moment Layla knew the silence had nothing to do with inability. Ethan, however, was not interested in theories. At dinner that evening, when Layla casually mentioned Sophie's French, he dismissed it. She must have repeated something she overheard on television, he said without looking up from his tablet. Layla caught the way Sophie's shoulders dropped. It was the kind of quiet defeat a child should never have to feel. Days in the Caldwell home followed a predictable rhythm. Ethan leaving early for meetings, Sophie spending long hours in the playroom, and Layla trying to find cracks in the wall between them. Sometimes she would catch Sophie sketching detailed maps of cities she had never visited. Sometimes it was poetry in Spanish, all of it hidden in a small notebook she kept under her bed. Outside the house, the whispers grew louder. At a charity gala, a family friend asked Ethan if he had looked into special schools for children with delays. Ethan's polite smile held, but his grip on his wine glass tightened. Instead of defending his daughter, he nodded as though the remark had merit. Layla saw it, and her respect for him thinned. When Sophie's 6th birthday came, the celebration was grand in scale but hollow in spirit. Dozens of guests, a cake taller than the child herself, but not a single moment of warmth between father and daughter. She unwrapped an expensive music box shaped like a carousel and turned it once. The tune played in soft, perfect notes, and for the briefest moment, Sophie hummed along. Ethan did not notice. Layla did. Why now? Layla had pieced together a troubling picture. Sophie was not silent because she lacked the ability. She was silent because she had learned that her voice had no value in her father's world. That realization struck harder than any medical diagnosis could. The breaking point was still to come, but the path toward it was already paved. It began with Ethan's refusal to believe, grew in the space between Sophie's talents and his neglect, and would soon erupt in a moment so public, so undeniable, that it would force the truth into daylight. The afternoon sunlight poured through the tall windows of the Caldwell living room, spilling over the polished wooden floors. Layla had been helping Sophie with a small art project, folding bright paper into origami cranes. Sophie's small fingers moved with careful precision, her eyes fixed on the folds as if each one mattered. A knock at the door interrupted them. It was Hannah Wells, a family acquaintance who visited often to discuss business with Ethan. She stepped inside, carrying the air of someone who enjoyed observing others more than speaking to them. Her gaze landed on Sophie and Layla, then lingered just a moment too long. Ethan entered moments later, phone in hand. His conversation ended abruptly when Sophie, without hesitation, greeted Layla in French and began to sing softly. Layla smiled, encouraging her to continue. The melody was clear, the pronunciation perfect. Hannah raised an eyebrow. "I thought she could not talk," she said. The words cut through the air like glass breaking. Ethan's expression hardened. His attention shifted from Sophie to Layla, suspicion darkening his eyes. "Where did she learn that?" he demanded. Layla explained calmly that Sophie had been speaking French for weeks, that she understood more than anyone realized. She expected Ethan to feel pride, maybe even relief. Instead, his voice grew sharp. "You are filling her head with nonsense. You are making her look unstable." Sophie froze. The light in her eyes dimmed as she folded her hands in her lap. Layla's chest tightened. She wanted to protect the child from every word being thrown across the room. Ethan turned to Hannah. "You see the problem. This is why I have been careful. People like her," he gestured toward Layla, "turn small issues into a spectacle." The next morning, the tension only deepened. Ethan called Layla into his office. The heavy oak desk between them felt like a barrier. "You have been overstepping," he said. "From this moment, your services are no longer required." His tone carried finality. Layla tried to reason with him, explaining that Sophie's silence was a form of self-protection, not a disability. She mentioned the notebooks, the maps, the poetry. None of it mattered. "She needs stability, not your experiments," Ethan replied, handing her an envelope. When Layla returned to the playroom to collect her belongings, Sophie stood at the doorway, holding the paper crane they had made the day before. She pressed it into Layla's palm without speaking, her eyes glistening. Layla knelt to hug her, whispering in French, "Your voice is a gift. Never forget it." Ethan's voice echoed from the hall, urging Sophie back to her room. The door closed, and the sound of the lock sliding into place sent a chill through Layla's spine. Outside, rain had begun to fall, soft at first and then heavy against the pavement. Layla walked to her car, gripping the small paper crane tightly. Her mind raced. She knew what she had seen in Sophie, and she knew it was worth fighting for. Somewhere in her satchel was a set of recordings, quiet moments of Sophie speaking, in multiple languages, her hands moving as she explained a story, her laughter unguarded. Layla had kept them without knowing why. Now, they felt like evidence. That night, she opened her laptop and began compiling everything she had: videos, notes, photographs. She thought about calling a former colleague, Daniel Reyes, a lawyer who had once defended a child in a similar case. She thought about Professor Maylin Chun, who had spent years researching selective mutism in children. The storm outside rattled the windows. Layla's reflection stared back at her from the dark glass, calm, steady, and determined. She had been underestimated before, pushed aside by people who believed her role was too small to make a difference. They had been wrong then. Ethan was wrong now. Some battles waited to be fought in the open. This one was not ready yet, but the first move had been made. Somewhere inside the Caldwell house, Sophie sat alone in her locked room, tracing her fingers over the edge of a paper crane, her lips silently forming words no one else could hear. The next morning, Naomi walked into Henderson Global headquarters with her chin high, even though every step felt like walking into a storm. The whispers had begun, not the casual kind she was used to ignoring, but sharp, deliberate murmurs that stopped the moment she passed. At the reception desk, Marjorie was already waiting. Not the cafe Marjorie. This was her in a tailored navy suit, holding a clipboard as though she owned the place. Naomi froze. "What are you doing here?" Naomi's voice was calm, but her hand tightened around the strap of her bag. Marjorie smiled, that slow, poisonous kind of smile. "Oh, I'm just consulting for the board. They brought me in to review some irregularities." She leaned in. "I told you, Mrs. Henderson, people talk. And they're talking about you." Naomi's pulse hammered in her ears. She walked past without another word, but she could feel Marjorie's smirk burning between her shoulder blades. Inside her office, a subtle change had taken place. Files that had been stacked neatly were now scattered. A framed photo of Blake and Leia had been moved, just enough to make her notice. Someone had been here. She called IT. "Login history looks normal," the technician said. "But, Mrs. Henderson, there's a flagged email sent from your account last night." Naomi's stomach dropped. "Last night I was at home." "What did it say?" He hesitated. "A confidential client file was forwarded to a competitor." "I'm sorry, but the board has been notified." Naomi hung up without answering. The trap was tightening. Later that afternoon, she met Blake for lunch in a quiet bistro downtown. Somewhere the walls did not have ears. She told him everything. "They're setting me up," Naomi said, her voice low. "Someone accessed my office, my email. They want me gone before next quarter." Blake's jaw clenched. This is bigger than Marjorie. She's just the distraction. He slid an envelope across the table. Inside was a security report from his own private investigator. The photos made Naomi's hands go cold. There was Marjorie, leaving the same upscale townhouse as Arthur Keene, the CFO of Henderson Global. Keene, who had been pushing for Naomi's dismissal for months. Keene, who had the most to gain if she fell. Naomi stared at the images. Why would he? "Follow the money," Blake said. "We're close, but we cannot tip them off yet. Let them think they're winning." Back at the office, the hostility became more open. A junior analyst she had mentored was suddenly cold, avoiding her eyes. Keene accidentally walked into her meeting and made a point of correcting her in front of the entire team. Still, there were glimmers of quiet defiance. Maya, her longtime assistant, left a post-it under Naomi's keyboard, check drawer. Inside was a flash drive. No label, no note, just data waiting to be unlocked. That night, Naomi plugged it into her laptop at home. Her breath caught. It was a financial ledger, one that did not match the official company books. Offshore transfers, shell accounts, and a pattern of withdrawals that led back to Keene. Her first instinct was to go straight to the board, but she hesitated. If she revealed her hand too early, they would bury her under counterclaims before she could prove anything. She needed more. The next day, Marjorie made her boldest move yet. Naomi was in the middle of a quarterly review presentation when the door opened, and Marjorie strolled in with two board members in tow. "Sorry to interrupt," Marjorie said sweetly, "but we need to address a matter of urgency." She set down a printed email, the same fabricated one Naomi had been accused of sending. "Mrs. Henderson, care to explain why this came from your account?" Every eye in the room turned to her. She could feel the weight of the silence pressing. Naomi straightened. "That email was not sent by me. And when the truth comes out, you'll see exactly who did." Marjorie's eyes glinted. "Then you will not mind a full forensic investigation, I'm sure." "Not at all," Naomi said, her voice steady even as her heart pounded. "In fact, I welcome it." There was a flicker in Marjorie's expression, just for a second, before she smiled again and swept out of the room. That night, Naomi sat in her living room staring at the ledger, the photos, the flash drive. She had enough to suspect, but not enough to convict. And every day she stayed, the risk grew. She thought of Leia, of the little girl who had seen her mother humiliated in a cafe just weeks before, and how she had held her hand tighter instead of letting go. She thought of Blake, who had believed her without hesitation. This was no longer just about her career. This was about proving that no one could erase her, not from her work, not from her family, not from her own name. She opened her laptop and began drafting a plan. The moment of truth was coming, and when it did, there would be no going back. The boardroom was already packed when Naomi arrived. Cameras from the internal PR team were set up in the corners, a transparency measure, Keene had called it. She walked in wearing a plain charcoal coat, no briefcase, no files in her hands. Marjorie and Keene sat together near the head of the table, their voices low, eyes gleaming. "Mrs. Henderson," Keene began, his tone dripping with false politeness. "Today is your opportunity to address the charges before the final vote on your position." Naomi nodded once and took her seat. Her coat stayed on. Marjorie leaned back, smiling. "We do hope you will keep this short. The evidence speaks for itself." Naomi's gaze swept the room. "Yes," she said softly, "it does." She stood, walked to the center, and with a slow, deliberate motion, unbuttoned her coat. Underneath was not her usual business blouse, but a crisp white jacket embroidered with the seal of the Columbia University Children's Rights Center. Murmurs filled the air. "I wore this," she continued, "because some of you have forgotten who I am and what I have done before Henderson Global. Before you try to erase me from this room, remember that I have spent my life fighting cases just like the one you are about to create here." She placed a thick folder on the table, not in front of herself, but directly in front of Keene. The red stamp across the top read, "Forensic Financial Audit. Independent Review." Keene's hand twitched and Naomi's voice did not rise, but every word carried. "This report shows 27 offshore transfers over the last year, routed through a shell corporation linked to your personal trust, Mr. Keene. The same corporation our competitor just so happens to own shares in." Gasps broke out. One of the board members stood to get a closer look. "And it does not stop there," Naomi went on. She turned toward the projector, where Maya was already at the controls. A single click brought up the first image, Marjorie leaving Keene's townhouse at night. The next slide, an email trail between Marjorie and Keene, planning the exact date of Naomi's disgrace. Marjorie shot to her feet. "This is a fabrication, is it?" Naomi's eyes locked on hers. "Because the IP addresses are in this file. The same IP address used to send that confidential email from my account. You walked into my office, you moved my things, you logged in under my name. And you were not careful enough to hide it." Keene tried to interrupt, but the room was shifting. Board members leaned forward, eyes sharp. The whispers now were not about Naomi. They were about him. Naomi let the silence stretch before she spoke again. "You wanted me humiliated. You wanted me gone before I could uncover this. But you forgot something. I do not walk away when the fight is about truth." She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a slim silver flash drive. "This is the full ledger. It has already been sent to the authorities. This meeting is not about my dismissal anymore. It is about your accountability." For the first time, Keene looked rattled. His jaw worked, but no sound came out. Marjorie's hands were clenched into fists, her confidence leaking away with every second. Then, from the back of the room, another voice spoke. "I can confirm everything she has presented." Heads turned. It was Daniel Reyes, the independent auditor Naomi had quietly hired weeks ago. He stepped forward, setting his own set of files on the table. "My firm verified every transaction. These findings are irrefutable." The weight of his words landed like a gavel. Naomi looked around the table. "You all know what needs to happen next. But before you cast your votes, understand this. I am not here to protect my title. I am here to protect the integrity of this company and the people who trust us." Her voice wavered for the first time, just slightly. "And I am here so that my daughter will know that when they tried to take my name, I did not bow. I stood." The room fell silent. Keene slumped back in his chair, staring at the folder in front of him like it might burn through the table. Marjorie looked away, her expression pale and hollow. One by one, the board members began to speak. The words suspension, investigation, and criminal liability replaced termination and dismissal. The tide had turned completely. Naomi gathered her coat from the back of her chair. At the door, she paused and looked over her shoulder. "You wanted a short meeting," she said to Marjorie, her tone calm but edged with finality. "Consider it over." And she walked out, the sound of hushed chaos rising behind her. The next morning, the air inside the courthouse felt different, lighter, almost expectant. It was as though the walls themselves knew something was about to change. When Ruth arrived, she was no longer the invisible cleaning woman people ignored. Instead, security officers nodded respectfully, Attorneys stepped aside to let her pass, and even strangers offered her warm smiles. Word had traveled fast about the night before, about her courage, her unwavering honesty, and the truth she had fought to bring to light. In the main hallway, she spotted Ethan already seated on one of the benches. His posture was straighter now, the quiet shame that once weighed on his shoulders replaced with a calm dignity. He wore his neatly pressed work shirt, not because he had to, but because it symbolized the years of honest labor no one could take from him. When their eyes met, Ethan smiled in a way she had never seen before, soft, grateful, and entirely free. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was charged. The presiding judge called the case forward, his voice steady yet carrying an undercurrent of satisfaction. After reviewing the evidence, he began, and hearing testimony from multiple credible witnesses, including Miss Ruth Daniels. The court finds in favor of the defendant, Mr. Ethan Cole. All charges are dismissed. Furthermore, this court acknowledges the injustice he has suffered and orders a formal statement to clear his name. A quiet gasp rippled through the spectators' seats. Some even began clapping before the bailiff hushed them, but the judge wasn't done. "There is another matter," he said, turning his gaze toward the opposing counsel's table. "The actions of Mr. David Harland," he nodded toward the man who had tried so hard to ruin Ethan, "constitute not only a breach of ethics, but a deliberate attempt to manipulate the justice system. This court will be referring him to the Bar Association for review and recommending disbarment." David's face drained of color. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. The gavel struck, and just like that, the fight was over. Ethan exhaled as if he had been holding his breath. For years, Ruth reached for his hand, and for the first time, he didn't shy away from touch. Instead, he gripped it tightly, as though grounding himself in the moment that as they stepped out into the sunlight, reporters swarmed around them. Flashbulbs popped, microphones extended, and questions flew through the air. But Ethan only said one thing. "Sometimes, the smallest voices can tell the biggest truths. I was lucky mine was heard because of Ruth." Ruth tried to hide her blush, but Ethan's words had struck deeper than he knew. That afternoon, the local news carried the story far beyond the courthouse steps. Headlines painted Ethan not as a disgraced worker, but as a man wronged and finally redeemed. Ruth's name appeared too. "Custodian helps expose corruption," a phrase she never thought she'd see beside her own photo. Within days, people from the community reached out to Ethan, offering everything from job opportunities to heartfelt apologies for having believed the worst. He didn't accept every offer, but he took the time to thank each person who extended kindness. One of the most unexpected calls came from the town's vocational school. They offered him a position teaching young people the same trade skills he had mastered over decades. "You've got more than just skills, Ethan," the director said. "You've got integrity, and that's worth passing on." Ethan accepted, though not before asking if there might be a position for Ruth as well. As fate would have it, the school needed someone to manage facilities, and Ruth fit the role perfectly. On their first day walking into the vocational school together, they paused outside the main entrance. A bronze plaque had been mounted near the door. It read, "In honor of those who stand for truth, even when it is difficult." Beneath the inscription were two names, Ethan Cole and Ruth Daniels. That Ruth's eyes shimmered as she read it. "We didn't do it for a plaque," she whispered. "I know," Ethan replied, smiling. "But it's nice to be remembered for the right reasons." In the months that followed, Ethan found joy in teaching, in seeing students' eyes light up when they mastered a skill. Ruth became a quiet anchor of the school, always ready with a warm word or a steady hand when things got hectic. Their friendship deepened into something unshakable, not romantic, but rooted in mutual respect, loyalty, and the kind of trust that only comes from surviving something harrowing together. The courthouse incident became a story people told with pride in their town. It was a reminder that truth still mattered, that sometimes justice did prevail, and that even those who seemed small or powerless could change the outcome of a fight. And though Ethan and Ruth never sought the spotlight, the light found them. Anyway, not because they chased it, but because they had stood firmly in it when it mattered most. The sun had dipped low, staining the horizon in soft gold as Elena stood at the gates of the Davenport estate one last time. The air felt different now, lighter, warmer, as if the walls themselves had released a breath they had been holding for years. Damien was gone, his empire dismantled piece by piece. The shame he had tried to bury Elena under had crumbled into dust, carried away by the same wind that now brushed gently across her face. In her hands, she held the small, worn leather notebook she had found on her first day working here, the one tucked behind the third panel in the library, where the Davenport family's most guarded secrets had been hidden. Back then, she had been too afraid to even touch it, terrified that one wrong move would end what little stability she had. Now, she flipped it open without hesitation, scanning the familiar pages of Damien's meticulously kept accounts, each line a record of corruption. She closed it for the last time, not out of fear, but because she no longer needed proof. Justice had already been served. As she turned to leave, her eyes caught on the old magnolia tree at the edge of the property, the one she had sat under as a child, dreaming of a life beyond the shadow of this house. Its blossoms swayed gently in the breeze, just as they had all those years ago, but this time she did not see them from the ground. She was walking past them, free, with the entire road ahead of her. That a small voice broke her thoughts. "Miss Elena?" She turned to see Samuel, the quiet gardener who had always slipped her fresh flowers in secret during the worst days. In his hand was a single magnolia bloom, creamy white, its petals perfect. He placed it gently in her palm. "For you," he said softly. "You planted hope here long before you knew it." She swallowed hard, a smile touching her lips. This was the kind of victory she had never imagined. Not the public applause, but the quiet knowing that she had survived. And more than that, she had reclaimed herself. As she stepped through the gates, she tucked the magnolia into her coat pocket. Years from now, no matter where life took her, she knew she would remember the feel of it against her heart, a reminder that even in the deepest shadows, something beautiful could bloom.